Good morning, Flagler County. I'm Rich Carroll. You're listening to Flagler's Morning News on Tuesday, April 11th.
It was a really scary time for people living in Palm Coast.
That's Carl Laundrie, the former bureau chief for the Palm Coast News Tribune and contributor to the Daytona News Journal, reflecting on coverage of the so-called Ninja Killer. Laundrie tells WNZF that Palm Coast was a much different place back in 1989.
People living basically out in the woods, one block and one house. And the first house on the block. Now, later, the block filled in and you had neighbors and everything else. But back when this occurred, there were several houses that just sat by themselves out in the forest. So that made this murder particularly frightening to the residents of Palm Coast because there were several people in the same situation where, there could be somebody outside in the woods circling around the house and you wouldn't even know it.
Louis Gaskin is set to be executed by lethal injection tomorrow night after the Florida Supreme Court rejected Gaskin's appeal and denied a stay of execution. Gaskin was convicted of the 1989 murders of Robert and Georgette Sturmfels in Palm Coast's R section.
The whole fact where he cut the phone line, there was no cell phone where you could call 911 and tell them what's going on. I mean, there may have been cell phones, but not in popular use back then.
Laundrie remembers haunting details about the trial.
What really incensed people was what he was doing is stealing these items for Christmas presents. It was just too hard to imagine. Shooting people and stealing items from their house to give to his friends for Christmas presents. Crazy, crazy act. Of course, once the details of the people who were murdered came out, could have been anybody in Palm Coast. That's what was uncomfortable for residents of Palm Coast.
Gaskin's attorneys have one final move. They're appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court. This local news is a service of Flagler County's Toyota dealer, Beaver Toyota, US 1 St. Augustine, here to wow you. The Florida legislature acts on a hidden cost that lawmakers say affects the price of many items.
19th District Representative and Speaker of the House Paul Renner describes what's behind the so-called tort tax or lawsuit tax.
The Florida Chambers estimated and other groups have estimated that between $800,000 and $5,000 a year is what each Floridian pays for all the hundreds of thousands of lawsuits out there, some of which are legitimate, obviously, but many of which are, I sue, I demand $1 million on something that's worth, and I settle for $30,000. But in the midst of all that, there's a lot of attorney's fees churned out, and all of that cost has to go somewhere.
And those costs get passed on to the consumer because businesses have to pay more for insurance.
We took a number of steps to make sure that our litigation climate allows real claims to move forward. If somebody's hurt, somebody's at fault for that injury, that they have to pay up. But we're not going to have a situation where everybody with a pocket is going to get picked.
Governor Ron DeSantis says Florida accounted for 8% of all property insurance claims nationally, but 80% of property insurance litigation. For Flagler's Morning News, I'm Rich Petchke.
Flagler County's top cop talks about why he believes Florida now has concealed carry without a permit.
This bad guy got stopped in Flagler County last week for possession of fentanyl, methamphetamine, and other illegal drugs. Sheriff Rick Staley said he also had 4 guns in his car.
And I guarantee you, he didn't go get a license because he couldn't get it. I guarantee you he didn't get those guns legally through a firearms dealer. And I guarantee you he didn't take any training classes on how to use it. So why should responsible, law-abiding citizens that can lawfully carry a gun in the state of Florida because they're not a convicted felon, they're not certified as having mental health issues, why do they have to go buy a license, basically, to be able to carry a gun? And I believe that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And so I think that the more armed citizens we have, these criminals can go elsewhere. Now, our crime rate's down 54%, so we're doing a great job in Flagler, but it's not at zero. And I would much rather work a justifiable homicide that a citizen did to protect themselves or their family or someone else, and every case is different, than a dirtbag killing one of our residents because the state said you had to have a license.
Listen to the Business Report on Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock on WNZF and on the Flagler radio app. From the WNZF newsroom, I'm Deb Albertson.
And now you're up to date on Flagler's Morning News. I'm Rich Carroll.